Imagine spending years designing the most technically advanced car your country had ever seen. You tested it with actual aeronautical engineers. You ran wind tunnel experiments. You rethought everything, the shape, the weight, the way air moves around metal at 60 miles per hour. Then you unveiled it to the world, and the world said it was ugly. Not quietly, not politely, loudly, consistently, and for 4 brutal years, until the company buried the whole project and moved on like it never happened. This is the story of the Chrysler Airflow. A car that was scientifically correct, commercially catastrophic, and 50 years ahead of its time. And if you're the kind of person who loves stories where the smartest idea in the room still manages to lose, stick around, because this one's for you. To really understand why the Airflow was so radical, you first have to picture what American cars looked like in the early 1930s. They were tall, boxy, built like moving furniture. The windshield stood upright like a window frame. The fenders jutted out from the body as if someone had bolted them on as an afterthought, which, essentially, they had. Headlights sat on metal stalks. Running boards lined the sides. The engine lived up front behind a tall, flat hood, and the radiator grille stood vertical and imposing because that was simply what a car looked like. Nobody questioned it. But here's what's fascinating: this wasn't pure laziness. There was a strange logic buried underneath it all. The men who designed early automobiles came from the horse-drawn carriage world. And carriages were tall because horses needed vertical clearance. Running boards existed because carriage steps had always existed. The engine sat up front because the horse had always stood up front. Every generation of engineers took the car before theirs, made small refinements, and never once stopped to ask whether the fundamental shape made any physical sense. By 1933, those unquestioned assumptions were 30 years old. Meanwhile, the Great Depression had wiped out dozens of automakers. What survived was essentially a 3-company race: General Motors on top, Ford in the middle, and Chrysler fighting to stay in the conversation. None of them had paused to ask a very basic question: what should a car actually look like if it has to move through air? One engineer finally asked. His name was Carl Breer, and he was one of the founding engineers of Chrysler itself, part of a technical trio alongside Fred Zeter and Owen Skelton that gave Walter Chrysler the engineering credibility to launch his company in the first place. Sometime in the late 1920s, Breer was standing outside his home when a formation of military aircraft flew overhead. For a split second, he mistook them for a flock of geese. The silhouettes were almost identical. That moment lodged itself in his mind. He started thinking about birds, why they're shaped the way they are, how they interact with air, what makes them efficient. Then he looked at the boxy, rattling automobiles around him and asked a question that sounds simple but had genuinely never been seriously explored in American automotive engineering. What if we designed a car the way nature designs things that move fast? Breer reached out to Orville Wright, yes, that Orville Wright who pointed him toward wind tunnel research. Chrysler then built one of the very first wind tunnels ever used to test automobile designs. Not a large facility, a working tool. And what they found when they started running tests would have been funny if it weren't so damning. The standard 1930 American automobile was, from an aerodynamic standpoint, a catastrophe. The flat front face built up a solid wall of compressed air. The tall body acted like a sail, catching the wind. The protruding fenders, the stock-mounted headlights, the running boards, all of it created turbulence that compounded the drag in every direction. Breer's team ran a calculation that must have been equal parts hilarious and horrifying. Driving one of these cars forward was aerodynamically almost identical to driving it backwards. They weren't being poetic. The numbers actually said that. So they started from scratch. The shape that emerged from hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing looked like nothing on American roads. A rounded, sloping nose. A long, tapered rear end. A body that flowed in one uninterrupted surface rather than a collection of separate panels bolted together. Fenders that melted into the body. Headlights set flush rather than mounted on stalks. A raked, curved windshield. Every single surface was shaped around one guiding principle: let the air move around the car rather than slamming into it. But the aerodynamics were only part of the revolution. Here's something most people don't. You know about 1930s. American cars. They were genuinely dangerous to drive at speed. Not in the way we think of danger today, but because of where the engine sat. With the engine pushed far ahead of the front axle, roughly 80% of the car's total weight pressed down on the front wheels. The result was severe understeer. The front end resisted turning. The car felt nervous and unwieldy at highway speeds. And keeping it in control required real effort and concentration. Breer's team moved the engine back, all the way back until it sat directly over the front axle. The weight distribution shifted to something close to 55 to 45, front to rear. That might sound like a small tweak. On the road, it transformed the driving experience completely. And here's another consequence nobody fully anticipated. With the engine repositioned, the rear passenger seat could be placed in the middle of the wheelbase instead of over the rear axle. If you've ever ridden in a vehicle where every bump travels straight through the seat and into your spine, you understand why this mattered. Airflow passengers sat in the smoothest part of the car, cushioned from road imperfections in a way no American production vehicle had offered before. The Chrysler engineers also pushed towards something close to unified body construction, what we now call unibody design. Rather than building a separate frame and dropping a body on top of it, the body panels and structure worked together as a single load-bearing unit. Lighter, stiffer, more efficient. On paper, this car was genuinely extraordinary. The question was whether America was ready for it. The Airflow arrived in dealerships in January 1934. Chrysler offered it in two versions, the Chrysler Airflow and the more accessible DeSoto Airflow, both sharing the same engineering DNA. The design world was immediately electrified. Industrial designers who had spent years theorizing about streamlined aesthetics recognized in the Airflow something they had never seen in an American showroom. A production car that actually practiced what the movement preached. Norman Bell Geddes, the visionary designer who had been writing about streamlined transportation for over a decade, praised it openly. European automotive journalists were fascinated. Then there were the American car buyers. They thought it was ugly. That's the exact word they kept using. In showrooms, in letters, in newspaper columns, ugly. The rounded nose looked strange. The integrated fenders looked wrong. The waterfall grille, which Chrysler had designed to be visually appealing while maintaining the aerodynamic profile, reminded too many people of a face with a severe overbite. Someone described the car as an upside-down bathtub, and in the way that cruel nicknames do, it spread. Would you have bought it? Honestly, sitting in 1934, surrounded by tall, upright cars with vertical grilles and protruding fenders that you'd seen your whole life, and a salesman points you toward this low, rounded, organic-looking thing. It must have felt like being offered something from a completely different world. General Motors customers walked past the Airflow and bought more General Motors. Ford customers bought more Fords. The Conquest sales Chrysler had projected customers switching from competitors drawn by the innovation never materialized. And then things got worse. Here's the uncomfortable truth that tends to get buried in the engineering triumph version of this story. The Airflow was rushed. The aerodynamic research was real. The weight distribution work was genuinely pioneering. The wind tunnel results were valid. But somewhere between the engineering labs and the production line, things went wrong. The new unibody construction was architecturally advanced and not yet fully mastered. Early Airflows developed squeaks and rattles within months of leaving the factory. Doors that fit perfectly at assembly gradually stopped fitting correctly with use. Body panels flexed. There were reports of more serious structural failures. The dealers knew. The customers knew. And in the way of automobile reputation, the word spread faster than any advertisement could counter it. Chrysler worked quickly, issuing fixes, refining the assembly process, improving build quality as the production run continued. By 1935, a new Airflow was a substantially better built car than what had left the factory in 1934. But reputations, once damaged, don't follow the same timeline as engineering corrections. The sales numbers confirmed what everyone feared. In 1934, Chrysler moved just over 11,000 Airflows, and DeSoto sold roughly 13,000. For a car that was supposed to announce Chrysler's technological dominance over its two larger rivals, those figures were a quiet disaster. Chrysler's response to the falling numbers was, in hindsight, the move that sealed the Airflow's fate. They started making it look normal. The 1935 model received a revised front end more upright, more conventional, with a grille that gestured toward the traditional vertical look buyers apparently needed. Each subsequent year moved further in the same direction. By 1937, the Airflow had been so thoroughly modified away from its original form that it had lost the visual logic that made it coherent in the first place. It no longer looked boldly futuristic. It just looked confused, like a car that had started as one thing and been apologized into something else. Sales kept declining anyway. Chrysler pulled the plug after the 1937 model year. No announcement, no successor, no acknowledgement of what had been attempted. The engineering team moved to other projects. The wind tunnel research was filed away. Walter Chrysler, who had personally championed the project, died in 1940. The total production run across all 4 years, and both marques came to roughly 80,000 units. For context, Ford alone sold over 1 million cars in 1934. The Airflow wasn't just commercially unsuccessful. By mass market standards, it barely registered. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the engineering achievements the Airflow represented weren't diminished by the sales failure. They were just ignored. The drag coefficient of a standard 1,933 American car was approximately 0.6. The Airflow came in around 0.5. That sounds like a modest improvement until you remember that aerodynamic drag increases with the square of speed. At 30 miles per hour, the difference is noticeable. At 60 miles per hour, it's substantial. At anything higher, the gap grows wider still. For comparison, a modern Toyota Camry sits around 0.28. A Porsche 911, about 0.29. The Airflow's 0.5 looks unremarkable against those numbers. But against everything else on American roads in 1934, it was a genuine leap forward. The handling transformation was arguably more immediately valuable to anyone who actually drove one. Contemporary test drivers consistently describe the Airflow as different in a way that was hard to put into words, but immediately apparent, planted, responsive, calm at speed in a way nothing else from that era was. And here's one the engineers hadn't specifically planned for. The car was extraordinarily quiet at highway speed. The smooth, flush surfaces that reduced aerodynamic drag also reduced the turbulence that creates wind noise. In an era when highway wind roar was just accepted as part of driving, the Airflow's hushed cabin at 60 miles per hour read as genuine luxury. Every serious road test of the period noted it. The car was better to drive than it was to look at from the outside, which might be the most perfectly tragic automotive sentence ever written. While Chrysler was watching its bold experiment fail in American showrooms, something instructive was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. In Czechoslovakia, Hans Ledwinka at Tatra had been pursuing aerodynamic design on a parallel track. The Tatra 77, released in 1934, went even further than the Airflow rear-mounted air-cooled engine. Full teardrop body, a central stabilizing fin running down the roof, a drag coefficient that undercut the Airflows. A young engineer named Ferdinand Porsche was paying close attention. The resemblances between specific Tatra design choices and the Volkswagen Beetle that Porsche would later develop are not coincidental after the war. Tatra sued Volkswagen for patent infringement and won a settlement. Also in 1934, Citroën released the Traction Avant front-wheel drive, unibody construction, independent suspension, dramatically lower and wider than contemporary American cars. Better weight distribution. Handling that embarrassed most of what Detroit was building. In Europe, the ideas the Airflow represented were not received as a failed experiment. They were received as the obvious direction forward. European manufacturers absorbed them, refined them, and built on them. The streamlined, low-slung aesthetic that American buyers had rejected became the continental standard within a decade. In America, the industry looked at the Airflow's sales figures, collectively shrugged, and went back to building what people said they wanted. The consequences for Chrysler extended well beyond the Airflow itself. The company had invested millions in development, the wind tunnel research, the engineering work, the production retooling. None of it had returned a profit. More importantly, the Airflow drained something less tangible: Chrysler's appetite for risk. After 1937, the company built competent, conservative, reliable automobiles. Good cars, safe cars. Not cars that started from first principles and reimagined what a car could be. General Motors, watching from a comfortable market share lead, drew the lesson they wanted to draw. Americans don't want aerodynamic cars. The streamlined styling elements that began appearing on GM products in the late 1930s were largely decorative, aesthetic borrowing, without functional commitment. The DeSoto brand carried a particular burden. Unlike Chrysler, which maintained other conventional models, DeSoto had offered the Airflow as its primary option in its price class for most of the production run. Buyers who wanted something familiar had nowhere to go within the brand. DeSoto never recovered its pre-Airflow standing. And here is the strange, almost poetic irony of the whole episode. The aesthetic that Americans rejected on cars was embraced enthusiastically elsewhere. The Burlington Zephyr, unveiled in 1934, became one of the most celebrated design objects of the decade. Stainless steel, streamlined, breathtaking. The same visual language that made the Airflow look wrong on a showroom floor made the Zephyr look right, racing across the American prairie. The streamlined train became iconic. Douglas Aircraft applied the same aerodynamic reasoning to the DC-3, which became the most commercially successful transport aircraft of its era. The ideas weren't wrong. They just needed a different stage. Carl Breer lived until 1970. He was alive when fuel economy regulations in the 1980s finally forced the American auto industry to take aerodynamics seriously, the thing he had demonstrated in a wind tunnel in 1929, the Ford Taurus, arriving in 1985, triggered a wave of aerodynamic design across American car manufacturing. Rounded forms, flush surfaces, integrated components, managed airflow, everything the Airflow had argued for 50 years earlier, now mandatory, because physics had finally become more persuasive than consumer preference surveys. The drag coefficient is now a primary design parameter for every production vehicle on Earth. Automotive engineering programs worldwide teach the principles Breer's team worked out in a small wind tunnel in Detroit. Unibody construction is now universal. Integrated body surfaces are standard. Engine placement is determined by weight distribution targets, not tradition. None of the manufacturers that profited from these advances paid for the original research. Chrysler paid for it, and then got punished for doing so. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Airflows survive in some condition, though the number in genuinely restorable shape is considerably smaller. The major automotive museums have them. Dedicated pre-war collectors have built reputations around finding and restoring them. If you ever get the chance to see one at a concours event, Pebble Beach occasionally hosts strong pre-war American classes. Take it. What strikes people seeing one in person for the first time is how contemporary it looks. Against everything else from 1934, stand a Chrysler Airflow next to a Ford from the same year, and the Ford looks like it belongs to the era it came from. The Airflow looks like it wandered in from a different timeline, one where the design decisions that defined the 1950s happened 2 decades earlier. The restoration community debates it constantly. Do you preserve the car as it left the factory, or do you modify it to better reveal the engineering achievement underneath? It's a disagreement that says something about what the Airflow actually was, not just a product, but a statement, a demonstration. The Chrysler Airflow was built by people who were right, not approximately right, not eventually right, in 1934, demonstrably, measurably, scientifically right, and the market made them pay for it anyway. The companies that watched them fail, took notes quietly, and waited for the right moment made the money. The engineers who did the original work watched their discoveries become industry gospel without their names attached. That's not a story unique to the automobile industry. But it might be one of the cleanest examples of it, the gap between being first and being rewarded, written out in production numbers and wind tunnel data and the slow arc of 50 years. The showroom had a bad decade. The engineering was forever. What do you think could better marketing have saved the Airflow? Or was America simply not ready for it, no matter what Chrysler had done? Drop your thoughts below. And if stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe. We do this every week.